He was 19, she was over 60. Naked from the waist up, he knelt before her with 3 other boys, trembling, oiled, and trained in the art of silence. The gold-threaded curtains around the bedchamber barely moved, but the room pulsed with fear. They had been summoned from among the Imperial entertainers, bathed for hours, instructed on how to speak, how to breathe, how to please. The eunuchs had warned them, she may touch you, she may ignore you, but do not speak unless commanded, do not look her in the eyes. Behind a silk veil, the Empress leaned back, face half hidden in shadow. Her hand moved lazily, pointing toward the youngest of the 4. That was all it took. One would be led into the inner bedchamber. The others, history never recorded their names, because this wasn't just a queen choosing a lover. It was an emperor choosing which man would live another night. And yet, this woman who ruled China with her body and her mind was once just a girl, a concubine, a servant to a dying emperor. But she watched, she remembered. And when the moment came, she rose. But not as a wife, not as a queen, not even as a woman. She rose as a god. If you enjoy watching and learning about history, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore history together from all around the world. She was just 14 when she was taken from her home and delivered to the Imperial palace, not as a bride, not as nobility, but as a concubine. Her name was Wu Zetian, a common girl from a relatively modest background. Her destiny, as dictated by centuries of Confucian order, was to serve, to be silent, and to disappear. Emperor Taizong had hundreds of women. Wu was barely noticed. Officially she was ranked as a Huangdi, the 5th tier among 9, decorative, disposable. Other girls cried when they were left alone in the echoing marble corridors, but Wu did not cry. She watched. She watched who the emperor favored. She studied the eunuchs who ran the court. She memorized the rhythms of the inner palace, who visited whom, who whispered in corners, who vanished after offending the wrong person. While the other girls competed for beauty, Wu competed for knowledge. She learned that pleasing a man was not about beauty, but about knowing when to be useful, when to disappear, when to remain absolutely still. She memorized the classics. She trained her voice to sound soft even when issuing commands. She began to read the emperor's mood before he spoke, and she waited. For 6 years she served in near total obscurity. She was never one of Taizong's favorites, but she left an impression, not on the emperor, but on someone else. Because during her time in the palace, the emperor's son, Prince Li Ji, often passed through the women's quarters, and though he was already married, and though Wu was just a forgotten girl in silk, something passed between them. A glance, attention. History would later condemn what happened next as scandalous. But to Wu, it was destiny. When Emperor Taizong fell ill, the palace shifted. Everyone waited for death, and for the next ruler. Wu knew what would happen. Concubines who bore no sons were to be sent to tall Buddhist convents. Shaved bald, cloistered, forgotten. And so, at age 20, that's exactly where Wu Zetian was taken. Most women never returned from such exile. But Wu did. And she didn't come back alone. The gates of the Buddhist convent clanged shut behind her. Wu Zetian's head was shaved, her robes were coarse, her life, as far as the world was concerned, was over. But for Wu, this was not a tomb, it was a corridor, and she was not done walking. Across the palace, a new emperor sat the dragon throne. Li Zhi, the son. He was young, weak-willed, emotionally overwhelmed by the weight of ruling, and beside him was an empress, Empress Wang, desperate to hold her place. But in her desperation, Empress Wang made a mistake that would cost her everything. She allowed Emperor Gaozong to visit the Buddhist convents, to offer donations, to show compassion to forgotten women. And when he visited Wu Zetian, now a 24-year-old nun with no hair but eyes full of memory, he fell under her spell all over again. What passed between them behind the convent walls was never recorded. But weeks later, Wu Zetian was summoned back to the palace. It was unprecedented, it was blasphemous, it was illegal. No emperor had ever taken his father's concubine as his own lover. To Confucian officials, this was incest, a violation of the sacred familial hierarchy. A woman who had once called Taizong her master was now lying in bed with his son. But the emperor did not care. Wu Zetian's return to court marked the beginning of a quiet war, not with swords but with bedsheets and whispers. She re-entered the palace as a low-level concubine once again, but her rise was immediate. The emperor wanted her, he needed her. He began neglecting the empress and his previous favorite, consort Xiao. Jealousy ignited like wildfire. The inner palace was no longer about love, it was a battlefield. But Wu did not panic, she calculated. She began to secure allies among the eunuchs. She made quiet pacts with minor officials. She learned who hated whom and how to exploit it. And then, one by one, she moved to remove her rivals. First, she accused Consort Xiao of witchcraft, a crime punishable by death. Rumors were planted, servants bribed. Then came Empress Wang. Wu accused her of trying to poison the emperor. The court split in terror. The emperor, besotted and politically spineless, sided with Jut, but it wasn't enough. The empress was still legally protected. Wu needed a final blow, a scandal so shocking it would eliminate them both forever. And that's when something unthinkable happened. Wu gave birth to a daughter, but shortly after the child was born, the infant died suddenly. No one saw how, no one knew why. Wu, through tears, accused Empress Wang of suffocating the baby in a jealous rage. The palace exploded in chaos. Whether the accusation was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was power. Wang and Xiao were seized, beaten, imprisoned, tortured. And then, in front of court officials, their limbs were hacked off and their bodies displayed in the marketplace. Empress Wu was victorious. She had turned grief into strategy, loss into gain, desire into dominance. From here on, she would no longer rise through others. She would now rise over them. With Empress Wang executed and Consort Xiao silenced forever, the imperial court expected the emperor to appoint a new empress, likely someone from a noble family, someone appropriate, respectable, and safe. Instead, he crowned Wu Zhao, the daughter of a timber merchant, a former concubine, a defrocked nun. And now, Empress of China. The court gasped. Ministers protested. Historians scribbled in horror. But the emperor did not care. Wu had wrapped him in layers of need, obedience, and illusion. He was emperor in name, but it was Wu who ruled the court, Wu who approved petitions, Wu who shaped the future. As empress, she wasted no time transforming the court into an engine of loyalty. Ministers who hesitated were demoted, officials who whispered were arrested, eunuchs who served her enemies vanished without a trace. But the palace wasn't the only thing she reshaped. She targeted the past, and Bai rewrote it. Court historians who painted her rise as scandalous were imprisoned. Family records were revised. Scribes were ordered to portray her ascent as destined by the heavens. Wu wasn't just eliminating threats, she was erasing memory. And her ambition wasn't finished. When the emperor fell sick with chronic illness, likely due to hypertension or stroke, Wu stepped in fully as regent. She sat behind the throne, screened by a golden curtain, listening to ministers, answering in his name. China, one of the most powerful empires on earth, was being governed by a woman, and not just any woman, a woman who had already shown she would kill her own child to secure power, because by now whispers were circulating. The death of Wu's infant daughter, the accusation against Empress Wang, it was too perfect, too timely. Some believed Wu had smothered the child herself with her own hands, only to fabricate the crime that justified her rival's executions. It was a theory no one dared voice publicly, but the court never forgot it, because it meant Wu was capable of anything. And she proved that again, when she began to destroy her own bloodline. She had 4 sons with Emperor Gaozong. At first, they were seen as her legacy, but one by one they became threats. Her first son criticized her interference in government. He was demoted and sent away. Her second son grew popular with the army. He was exiled. Another son died mysteriously. Poisoned? No one dared ask. By the time Wu reached the peak of her power, she had imprisoned or eliminated nearly every potential rival, including those who shared her blood. It was no longer about ruling beside the emperor. It was about becoming the emperor. And in the year 690 AD, she did the impossible. She declared the end of the Tang dynasty and the beginning of her own Zhou dynasty. She issued a new name, Zetian Huangdi, divine sovereign. No more regent, no more consort, no more hiding behind a curtain. She was now Emperor Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to ever take the title Huangdi, not Empress, not Queen, but Emperor. And now that she sat on the dragon throne herself, she would build an empire that reflected her deepest desires. Desires for control, desires for adoration, and desires of the flesh. By the time Wu Zetian declared herself emperor in 690 AD, she had already learned the truth about power. It was not inherited, it was maintained through one fear. And so, she built on a machine of silence. A network of Quarton, secret police, known as the Imperial Bureau of Investigation, began operating throughout the empire. These men reported only to her, and they had one purpose: to hunt voices. Voices of disloyalty, voices of dissent, voices of memory. Informants were placed in ministries, monasteries, universities. Teachers disappeared after lessons. Poets vanished after performances. Officials were arrested based on a single rumor, and once accused, the fate was worse than death. Men were dragged into dungeons, interrogated for days. Tongues were removed, hands crushed. Executions were carried out in silence. No trials, no announcements. One noble family was accused of treason. 47 members were arrested, grandparents to infants. None survived. Their lands were seized. Their names were struck from the records. To the people, the message was clear. Your loyalty is not enough. Your silence is not enough. Only worship will do. Wu's terror reached even into Qian religious spaces. Monks who criticized her reign were beheaded. Temples that refused to display her edicts were burned. Even respected Buddhist masters were accused of sedition if their teachings hinted at male-only power. The rivers around Luoyang ran red. Corpses were found floating, mouths sewn shut. And still, her rule endured, because Wu was not careless. She mixed brutality with brilliance. She promoted scholars from lower classes. She advanced women in government. She allowed critics to return, once broken and loyal. She rewrote the civil service exam to favor talent over birth. For every enemy she crushed, she elevated another voice, one that would sing her praises. But inside the palace, she trusted no one, not her court, not her lovers, not even her own sons. When her third son grew too confident, she had him removed from the line of succession. Another was placed under house arrest for showing ambition. The ministers began to murmur, "The emperor is alone," and so she filled the void with a different kind of companion. Young men, handpicked for their beauty, their charm, their obedience, began appearing in her court. Not as officials, not as scholars, but as playthings. The most famous of these were the Chang brothers, two entertainers in their 20s, known for their poetry and their perfect skin. Wu brought them into the palace, dressed them in silk, gave them golden titles. They were seen bathing her feet, feeding her grapes, and sleeping in her chambers. Officials who objected were executed. This was no longer a court, it was a stage, and Wu was both playwright and goddess. Ministers, once powerful men, were forced to bow before boys who barely spoke. Orders were issued not by generals but by jesters in gold, and Wu, now over 70, basked in it. She had reversed everything the empire had ever believed. Men served, women ruled, desire dictated policy, fear enforced it, but power built on terror has cracks. The people obeyed, but they whispered. The ministers bowed, but they plotted, and Wu knew it. She saw ghosts in every corridor, heard betrayal in every silence. She began sleeping in different rooms each night. Her food was tested by 3 tasters. Her scrolls were checked for invisible ink. Because deep down, she understood even gods can be overthrown, even empires can rot from within. And soon even Wu, the concubine who became emperor, would begin to feel the walls closing in. By the time Wu Zetian reached her 70s, she had outlived emperors, consorts, rivals, and even her own children. But she had not outlived her desires. The imperial court, once a space dominated by old men quoting Confucius, now whispered with something else, something closer to legend than law. Young men, dancers, musicians, poets, began appearing at the palace gates, not to serve the empire, but to serve the Empress. They were described as flowers in human form, chosen for their delicate beauty, soft voices, and pliant temperaments. Some were just teenagers, barely out of adolescence. Others were eunuchs, trained in obedience and flattery. They were brought in not as lovers but as offerings. The two most famous were Zhang Yiji and Huangdi Changzong, brothers from a modest background, skilled in music and flattery. Wu met them through palace performances and quickly elevated them to dizzying heights. She gave them imperial titles, robes woven with gold, land, power, but they held no military command, no administrative office. Their job was to bathe her, entertain her, and please her. Officials described scenes they could barely believe. The emperor reclining in a golden chamber, reading poetry while one brother massaged her feet and the other brushed her hair. She wrote them poems, let them wear her colors. She referred to them as her heavenly sons, and the ministers, grown men with decades of service, were now forced to bow before these boys, deliver reports through them, and pretend not to see the farce unfolding around them. But this wasn't just pleasure, it was revenge. For centuries, Qin emperors had kept harems of women, concubines, dancers, all silent and disposable. Wu turned the tables. What men once did to women, she now did to them. But with the full weight of the state behind her, and it terrified the court. Confucian scholars whispered that this was the unraveling of moral order, that the emperor had become a creature of lust, that the nation was being ruled by a woman whose throne sat between her legs. But none dared speak it aloud, not while she still breathed. Still, cracks were forming. The Zhang brothers began issuing commands in her name, influencing court appointments and threatening generals. Their arrogance knew no limits, because they believed they were untouchable. And in truth, for years, they were. Wu was old, tired, but emotionally addicted to the comfort they gave her. She had no true heirs left, no trusted generals, no powerful ministers, only boys who sang to her. She had reversed the harem, but in doing so she had isolated herself in a palace of mirrors and lies, and outside the empire stirred. The generals resented the Zhangs, the court resented Wu, and her enemies, the sons she had once exiled, waited in the shadows. The Empress believed her divine reign would continue forever, but every god is mortal, and betrayal, like lust, always comes from inside the palace. Wu Zetian had taken the throne. She had rewritten the rules of sex, family, and law. But there was still one realm left to conquer: heaven. For centuries, Chinese rulers had claimed the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule bestowed by the gods. But it was a concept shaped by men, for men. No woman had ever dared claim it outright. Wu decided to rewrite that too. She declared herself not just emperor, but divine. She began with language. A new Chinese character was created to represent her name, never used before, never repeated since. It combined elements of heaven, speech, and rule. It was untranslatable, designed to make her books semantically unique, above the written world. Then she turned to religion. Buddhism, long marginalized by Confucian elites, became her tool. She sponsored monks who supported her reign. She commissioned new scriptures, including the Great Cloud Sutra, which prophesied the coming of a female ruler who would bring peace and justice. Monks declared Wu as that savior, the living bodhisattva, a divine, enlightened ruler sent by the heavens. Temples were ordered to place her image beside the Buddha. Statues of Wu as a golden goddess were installed in monasteries across the empire, a veiled woman seated on a lotus, her hands raised in blessing, her eyes half closed in serenity. To her supporters, it was a triumph, a union of spiritual and political power. To her enemies, it was blasphemy. But no one could stop her. She rebranded her dynasty as the Zhou, wiping the Tang name from history. She renamed cities, invented holidays, rewrote rituals to center the emperor as a woman. No detail was too small. In public ceremonies, Wu wore robes embroidered with dragons, a symbol traditionally reserved for male rulers. She rode in chariots surrounded by fire-colored flags, declaring herself the mother of the nation. And the people, weary from years of war and chaos, obeyed. They bowed to her statues. They offered incense in her name. For the first time in Chinese history, an emperor was being worshipped as a woman. But divinity is a fragile mask. Behind the gold screens and incense smoke, Wu's body was failing. Her mind was sharp, but her health declined. She suffered strokes, her speech slurred. She relied more and more on the Zhang brothers, who now controlled access to her. The court, once silenced by terror, began to murmur again. Old generals long exiled, Ritu, went in whispers. Her surviving son, Li Xian, began gathering support. And the ministers knew Wu's immortality was an illusion. Because gods cannot bleed, but emperors can. And Wu was bleeding, slowly, invisibly, beneath layers of silk and smoke. The empire she built on seduction, blood, and doctrine was beginning to crack. In the final months of her life, Wu Zetian lived not as a goddess, but as a prisoner inside her own palace. Her body had withered, her speech faltered. The empress who once commanded armies with a glance now relied on attendants to lift her from bed. But the empire remained under her name. The Zhou dynasty still stood, if only on trembling legs. And surrounding her, like shadows feeding on weakness, were the Zhang brothers. They controlled who she spoke to, what letters she read, what decisions were brought to her bed. Ministers who tried to speak with Wu directly were blocked. Others were told she was sleeping or praying or ill. But Wu knew the truth. She was dying. And the only people left in her inner world were the very men who now used her like she once used others. For years she had ruled through manipulation and desire. Now, in her silence and weakness, the Zhang brothers ruled through her name. Until one morning, the gates of the palace were opened, not by Wu, but by her surviving son, Li Xian, and the generals who had once bowed before her. They walked into the throne room without resistance. The eunuchs said nothing. The ministers nodded. The Zhang brothers were seized on sight, dragged into the courtyard, beaten, beheaded. Their heads were down, displayed on spikes, just beyond the walls of Wu's chamber, a final, brutal reminder that her world was collapsing. And Wu, she was stripped of her titles, forced to abdicate. The woman who had renamed dynasties, deified herself, and ruled as emperor for 15 years, was now an old woman in bed, no longer sovereign. Just Lady Wu. They didn't kill her. No, that would have been too merciful. They let her watch it all unravel. The temples tore down her statues. Her portraits were burned. Her new written character was banned. Even her dynasty, the Zhou, was declared illegitimate, erased from official record. She was, in every sense, unmade. And when she finally died in 705 AD, her body was placed in a magnificent tomb beside her former husband, Emperor Gaozong. But her epitaph, the words meant to summarize the most extraordinary female life in Chinese history, was left blank, deliberately. No name, no title, no praise, no condemnation, just a silent, empty stone. Because no one knew what to say. Was she a hero, a tyrant, a demon in silk, a mother who killed, a girl who survived? Even now, over 300 years later, historians are all divided. Some see her as the ultimate feminist icon, a woman who shattered every barrier in a world built by men. Others call her a monster, who ruled through betrayal, murder, and lust. But one truth remains. Wu Zetian was the only woman in 5,000 years of Chinese history to become emperor. Not queen, not consort, not empress, dowager. Emperor. And whether she ruled through love or terror, blood or beauty, she ruled, and history could never decide what to do with her. So they left her story unfinished, a blank stone, a silenced scream, a woman who became a god and died a ghost.